Every one of you for being here today and taking time out of your busy schedule. My name is Stacy Pickering, and it's my privilege to serve as your state auditor here in Mississippi. As a reminder to you, for those of you that have recently joined us, today's town hall meeting and this discussion and dialogue is going to be broadcast live over the World Wide Web on www.americansolutions.com. Also will be on American Solutions Facebook page today. Again, if you have not turned off your cell phone or any other pager device, please take an opportunity to do so at this time, and we'll do our best to keep our flash photography at a minimum throughout today's program. We'd like to thank Millsaps College for hosting today's event, but before we begin, I'm reminded of the words of Dr. Benjamin Franklin. At the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, he reminded his fellow delegates that they needed to begin every session in prayer, seeking the providential hand of our Creator to guide our actions, our thoughts, and our deeds, if we ever even dreamed of being successful in forming this new government. I think it's appropriate that we begin our time here together today in prayer, and immediately after our prayer, I ask that you'll stand with me and recite our Pledge of Allegiance to our nation and to our nation's flag. Join me in prayer. Almighty God, our Creator of the universe and architect of our freedoms and our liberties, the inalienable rights that you have granted each one of us as your creation. We ask your hand of providence to be upon the proceedings today. We thank you for this great institution of higher learning, its mission and its purpose. We thank you for Speaker Gingrich, the vision and the leadership abilities and the communication skills that you've given him to challenge us, to improve our nation, to better serve our neighbors, our families, and our friends from one shore to the other. Father, we ask this blessing upon these proceedings. We ask your blessings and your guiding hand upon the leaders of the state of Mississippi and upon the United States of America. We ask this blessing in this prayer in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit forever. Amen. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our nation's flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. Today it's indeed an honor and a privilege to introduce to you the acting president of Millsaps College, Dean Howard McMillan. Now, Mr. McMillan is familiar to most of us here, but his way of introducing him to make sure we give him all the credit is due is more than just the dean, but is served as executive in residence here at Millsaps, the business school. Prior to that, he served as president of Deposit Guarantee National Bank. He is a product of the University of Mississippi, Harvard School of Business Administration, as well as the School of Banking of the South at Louisiana State University. He served as president of the Federal Reserve Board in Atlanta, Georgia, and is a past president of the American Association of Bankers. Join me in welcoming acting president, Dean Howard McMillan.
Thank you, Stacy. And on behalf of Millsaps College, I want to welcome all of you here. I appreciate you coming out. This is a great honor for Millsaps College to be able to host Speaker Gingrich and his town hall meeting, American Solutions, and their plan to revitalize the country. We're delighted to have them here, and I think this is going to be a great meeting. I'd like to introduce our Lieutenant Governor, Governor Bryant, and he will introduce the speaker. Phil?
Thank you. It is so good to have Howard McMillan. Good afternoon. Now, they said I only had a few moments, so I've got to get right to it. This is America Solutions, and my job is to look for Mississippi solutions. So last year when we started looking at the economy, we did something we had learned from a man named Ronald Reagan. We incentivized businesses with targeted tax cuts. So how many of you enjoyed your tax cut holiday the last weekend of July? Come on now. Yeah. We had holiday-sized crowds in the stores. They had to hire extra people to come in and just manage the inventory there. And then we cut taxes on farm and equipments and implements and repairs. You used to have to pay 7% tax to get your tractor fixed. So all those little garages in the Delta where I came from in Morehead, Mississippi were shutting down because they could go over to Arkansas and just pay 1.5% tax. So if your tractor broke, what'd you do? Well, you took it to Arkansas. So we said we're going to cut our taxes for repairing tractors and farm equipment in the state of Mississippi back down to 1.5%. And now we've got new small businesses cropping up there. We even cut taxes on a chemical. It's called CO2. It's great stuff. You capture it either naturally or part of the gasification process from one of our new clean coal plants, and you put it back in the ground, and it loosens up the oil that's there. At least 50% of the oil is still in the ground in Mississippi. At least half is still in the Tinsley field, the largest oil-producing field in Mississippi's history. Those are some of the things that we're doing. My solution is also, and last, and I've got to get off of here, but we've got to change the current budget system. It was designed in the 1930s and sort of helped a little bit in the 1980s, but it's an old line item model. It's not working. We've got to have performance-based budgeting that ties funding to outcomes and success. I know that's strange in government, but we're going to actually say if we give you money, we want to make sure you're doing something and have a strategic goal to tell us what Mississippi's solutions are. I've been asking this question all over the state of Mississippi. Now listen, because it's a town hall meeting, you've got to get involved. Many of you, now you know about the budget system in the state of Mississippi. We're about $700 million short of projected revenue by the end of the fiscal year. Last year, it took us 6 months to get to a budget, and the governor had to cut $172 million out of it. 60 days later, we did such a good job figuring that out. But I want to ask you something. All of you that think the current budget system in Mississippi is efficient and effective, raise your hand. Thank you. When I was in law enforcement, we call that a clue. We're going to change this system. We're going to reach for solutions in the state of Mississippi. There's nothing better, though, than spending a day with a great American like Newt Gingrich. And I'm going to let the great state auditor, Stacey Pickering, have the honor of introducing this great man because I've been with him. I think you're going to see one of the most enlightened brains in America. This man inspires me each time I'm around him, and he truly has a solution for America. On behalf of Governor Haley Barbour and the Lieutenant Governor's office, see, they told me to hurry. And I spent $800 on my eyes, and now my mouth won't work. So, on behalf of Governor Haley Barbour and the Lieutenant Governor's office, I want to welcome our very special guest. But for formal introductions, I want to recognize our wonderful state auditor, Mr. Stacey Pickering. Thank y'all for having us.
Thank you, Phil. Have a good afternoon. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. And aren't we privileged here in Mississippi to have somebody of that caliber to lead our state and lead our Senate, especially during these difficult economic times. Truly, if there ever has been someone that needs no introduction, it's our very special guest, the Honorable Newt Gingrich. He was the architect of the contract with America. In 1994, that led to the Republican Party, the conservative movement, gaining the majority and the control of the Mississippi House of the U.S. House of Representatives for the first time in over 40 years. It resulted in the most sweeping welfare reform our nation had ever seen. It resulted in the first tax cut for American families in 16 years. It resulted in not one, but 4 balanced budgets out of Washington, D.C. You would think that would be enough. In 1995, Time magazine recognized Newt Gingrich as Man of the Year. Made the comment about him, it said, some leaders make things happen. Exceptional leaders make things inevitable. And Newt Gingrich belongs to the category of the inevitable. What a great compliment, a comment of a visionary leader like Newt Gingrich. But the leadership he has provided our nation is not enough. It's the fact that he's written over 20 books, 11 of which have been on New York Times bestseller list. His latest book is called To Try Men's Soul. He and his wife, Callista, who live in Virginia, host and produce documentary and policy films. My personal favorite that my family and I enjoy tremendously is the chronicle of the odyssey of President Ronald Reagan's career and his presidency. It's called A Rendezvous with Destiny. I'd recommend it to any of you and your families. It's a great film that leaves you motivated and realizing the possibilities of what we can accomplish as Americans. He's the founder of Gingrich Consulting, and he's the general chairman of American Solutions, Winning the Future. Join me in welcoming our very special guest, the Honorable Newt Gingrich. you for being with us.
Let me, first of all, thank you for introducing me, and I also want to thank the Lieutenant Governor for being here. I had a wonderful meeting earlier with Governor Haley Barbour, who's an old friend and is just a great leader. I'm glad to have a chance to be back in his state. I also appreciate the students here, and I really appreciate Millsaps College opening up this opportunity for us to talk and to have some ideas. So I'm going to set the stage for a little while, and then we're going to toss it open to you and have you also share with us what you think we should do. I also want to welcome the people who are watching us, because we are streaming this live on the internet, and so we have folks who are actually watching from around the country, and for that matter, since it's the internet, from around the world. We are in a very challenging period. I think in many ways economically, this is the most challenging period since the Great Depression. And I think the President did the right thing in calling for a jobs summit today. I think he did the wrong thing in how he structured it and who he invited. Because he should have invited people who actually create jobs. He should have invited small businessmen and women, entrepreneurs. He should have invited the Chamber of Commerce, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the National Association of Manufacturers. I am underwhelmed to have a tenured faculty member from Harvard lecture the country on how to create jobs when they haven't ever created any. And it was very troubling a couple weeks ago to have the American Enterprise Institute do an analysis. And they looked at every president from George Washington to the present, and what percent of their senior leaders had experience in the private sector. And they found that the president whose senior leaders had the least experience in the private sector creating jobs is President Obama. And in fact, 8%, not 80, 8%, less than 1 in 10 of his appointments come out of the private sector. The rest either come out of government or out of academia. And with all due respect, you can be really smart in terms of writing a book or in terms of giving a lecture. But if you've never run a company, I run several small companies, and I know what it's like to hire people. I know what it's like to create capital. I know what it's like to meet a payroll. I know how seriously I have to worry to make sure that we're making the right strategic decisions so that all those families are still drawing a paycheck, building up their pension, and have health insurance. It's really hard. It's fundamentally different than back when I used to study it as a historian. You know, as a historian, you'd write the paragraph, he went out and founded a company. Well, there was 5 years of work in that sentence. And you didn't necessarily understand the 5 years of work. I've come up with 3 common sense analogies I want to use for a minute to try to explain at a fundamental level how difficult it is to deal with Washington. And just so you understand why I think it's so important to get to this basic, simple language. Today, the day when the president's holding his White House Jobs Summit, Senator Harkin and 5 Democrats in the House have announced they want to introduce a tax on stock to raise $150 billion. Now imagine, you're trying to get people to create jobs. You're trying to get people to create companies that would create jobs. And these guys are going out saying, why don't we tax you another $150 billion? So you have to say to yourself, what's going on in their mind? And here are my analogies. Imagine you had somebody who'd grown up and been told, the way you fix eggs for breakfast is you put them in the freezer. And so you came to their restaurant and you said, you know, I'd like a hard-boiled egg. And he said, oh, that has to go in the freezer for about an hour. And he said, well, maybe I'll have a soft-boiled egg. And he said, oh, that's only 20 minutes in the freezer. He said, okay, I'd like my eggs sunny side up. And they cracked them, they put them in the skillet, and they put it in the freezer. And he said, wait a second, I don't want to be offensive. It's your restaurant and you're the cook, but generally, when we cook eggs, we put them on a stove. He said, yeah, that's old-fashioned. You know, that's what those conservatives do. But I've come up with this new green technique for cooking. And so I put my eggs in the freezer. That's an example of how difficult it is. But let me give you a second example, which former Congressman Bob McEwen gave me, and I thought he caught it so perfectly. He said, you know, everywhere in the world, if you want to learn how to grow corn, you go to farmers. Because farmers actually grow corn. And you say, well, how do you grow corn? They say, well, you know, first of all, you have to get some capital so you can get land. And then you get a little bit more capital so you can buy the seed corn. And then you got to go out and you got to clean off the land and you got to plow it and you got to plant the corn. And then you got to fertilize the corn and may hope that there's going to be enough rain. And you got to take care of whatever pests come along and you got to make sure you weed it and keep out the weeds. And then over time, the stalk comes up. That's not corn yet. And then the stalk ultimately creates the corn, and then there's corn. And one day you go out and you get an ear of corn. Now, almost all of you, because Mississippi is still a pretty common sense place, almost all of you probably have actually seen corn. And you're probably aware that the system I just described is accurate. But imagine you'd spent your entire life in Chicago or at Harvard or in New York or in San Francisco, just to take a few places at random. And you'd read about corn and you'd eaten corn out of a can, but you'd never actually seen corn produced, but you knew it came out of cans. And so you said, why don't we have a corn summit? And so you invited people who had written novels about corn. And you invited people who had done their thesis on the theory of corn. And you invited somebody who had done an entire movie about corn. And you got them all in the room. And they said, well, don't you all want corn? They said, yeah, we're really hungry. We would really like corn. And so you decided to go out and have a corn rally. And you found a field. And you walked around the field for an hour chanting, we want corn. And there was no corn. So you called a press conference to attack all the capitalists who had failed to create the corn. That's where we are in Washington. It really is this bad. I mean, I would not be using these simple examples, except that it's that weird. Now, the baseline for our conversation today is something that Callista and I learned in making a new movie. When we interviewed Lech Wałęsa and Václav Havel for our movie about Ronald Reagan, both of them said to us, the former president of Poland and the former president of the Czech Republic, both of them said to us, the decisive moment in liberating Poland was in 1979, when the Pope went back as the first Polish Pope in history, and for 9 days he toured the country. And over a third of the people of Poland came out to see him. And he aroused such fervor and such passion that they never again relaxed. Before him, Solidarity had a few hundred members. A year later, they had 10 million. And so suddenly the Polish people were standing up to the dictatorship, and they came up with a slogan that's really different. I think it's the most important slogan of the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. And it's a little bold. 2 + 2 = 4. I know it's out on the edge. I'll bet even most of you in your classes could have gotten this, right? But it's very important when you think about this. This is very serious. Part of it comes from George Orwell's novel, 1984, where the state torturer says to the innocent citizen, if the state tells you 2 plus 2 equals 5, it equals 5. And if the state tells you 2 plus 2 equals 3, it equals 3. And the citizen's thinking, but what if it equals 4? But the more telling example comes from Camus' novel, The Plague, where Camus writes, there are times when a man will be killed for saying 2 plus 2 equals 4, because the authorities can't stand the truth. Now let me give you an example in American culture. I want to see it both up here and out here. How many of you can get this? I'm going to give you a very simple half of a sentence and see if you can get the second half. If you can't afford to buy a house, okay, let me. What'd you all say? All right, both sides here. This is really kind of strange. I used to teach in school, and if I had been teaching with this many students behind me, I'd have been nervous all the time. So I want both sides of the room now. Raise your hand if you agree, if you can't afford to buy a house, don't buy it. Raise your hand if you agree with that principle. So almost all of you, right? Now I want you to think about this. For 25 years, we've been lying to ourselves. What have we said for 25 years? If you can't afford to buy a house, the government will ignore the fact that you don't have any credit. The government will get you into a house with no down payment. The government will allow you to pay for 3 years without paying any principal. And the government will actually make sure that the interest is below the market level. And guess what happens? Because you can't afford to buy a house. So now we've lured you into a house you can't afford, and you go broke. Now, if you go broke personally, that's a personal tragedy. If 1 million people go broke, it's the 2007 housing collapse. Yet have you heard a single political leader in either party say, you know, what we're dealing with is a cultural crisis that happens to have an economic and financial implication? Why do the Chinese currently have $2 trillion in U.S. debt? It's not hard. Because we wanted to buy more than we earned. And frankly, if we're not careful under this administration, in a few years the Chinese will have $4 trillion. Now there's a morning when if you owe them enough, they own you. That's a very bad policy. So now let's go back to 2 plus 2 equals 4. And I really don't believe anybody in the White House understands this. I think they think 2 plus 2 equals whatever number they make up. The President said at the Job Summit today that the proposed big energy tax increase will not kill jobs. In fact, it will create jobs. This gets back to putting the egg in the freezer. If he honestly believes what he said today, there is no possibility he can develop a program to create jobs. And we're faced with 4 years of a mess. Because if you can talk yourself into believing that multi-$100 billion tax increase, you can argue it's worth it for some reason, but you ought to at least be honest about what it's going to do. And so that's where we are today. So what we did at American Solutions is we went back to the basics. And we asked 3 big questions that come together for where we are. Who are we? What does it take to compete successfully with China and India? And who threatens us, and what do we need to do to be safe? And in a way, they all fit into an economic plan. Let me start with who are we? This is my personal belief. It's the reason I wrote a book called Rediscovering God in America, and then Clifton and I turned it into a movie. Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. Our founding political document, not a theological document, political document, the Declaration of Independence, says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is truly extraordinary. We are the first country in history to say that power comes from God to each one of you and each one of you. And so you are personally sovereign. Your rights are inalienable. That means the president, the judge, the bureaucrat, the lawyer, none of them can take away your rights. And among your rights is the right to pursue happiness. Very important word. Notice, first of all, happiness in the Scottish Enlightenment meant virtue and wisdom. Did not mean hedonism and acquisition. And I saw the book in Jefferson's library where he underlined the phrase. But it's pursue. It doesn't say you have the right to achieve happiness. It doesn't say you have the right to have happiness. It says you have the right to pursue happiness. Now, why is that important? Because you have no right to sue if you're unhappy. There's no provision for happiness stamps from the government. There's no provision for a federal department of happiness. There's no provision to redistribute happiness. What you're guaranteed is the right to pursue it. Now, where does that come from? And this is a key part of thinking about how you create jobs. And for some people, it comes as a very sobering idea. The core of the American cultural experience is the work ethic. In the summer of 1607, Captain John Smith, at the very first founding of Jamestown Colony, says to a group of colonists, if you don't work, you won't eat. He does not say it to the poor. He says it to aristocrats who had paid their way over and said, hey, we paid for this, you can't make us work. And he said, fine, I'm not going to make you work, but you're not going to eat. So if you'd like to eat, you ought to work. If you don't want to work, you're not going to eat, fine with me. And they all decided to work. It was a key moment in American history. When we did welfare reform, people had reached the conclusion that staying at home, getting a check from the government, was destructive. It wasn't compassion. It was destructive. And it taught your children to lack energy and lack drive and lack discipline and lack vision. And so when we passed welfare reform, which replaced welfare with work and study, 65% of the people on welfare went to work or went to school. I was told that when we first brought it up, there were 140,000 people in Mississippi on welfare. Today, there are 20,000. That big a change. And it turned out people, when they went to work, were better. And they learned. And they acquired the work habit. And they showed up on time. And they gradually got better. And they earned a higher income. And their children learned you have to go to work. And now they did better. So we began to replace the cycle of poverty with the cycle of prosperity. But it's based on the work ethic. So if that's true, then you'd want to say, okay, how do I maximize the work ethic? And my daughter Jackie Cushman and I wrote a book called 5 Principles for a Successful Life. Very simple book. Dream big, work hard, learn every day, enjoy life, and be true to yourself. But they're old-fashioned virtues, and the reason they survive is they're true. They're like 2 + 2 = 4. I encourage every young person to dream big. I don't care what you dream big. And then you have to work hard, and that always comes as a great shock to people. A lot of people are willing to dream big if they can only win the lottery. In fact, very few people win the lottery. So now, how does all this apply? Why have we gotten into economic trouble? We have a tax policy which is anti-work, it is anti-jobs, it is anti-business, it is anti-savings, it is anti-investment, it is pro-debt, it's pro-bureaucracy, it's pro-red tape, it's pro-litigation. So you've had a country which has moved from creating wealth to redistributing wealth. Well, as Margaret Thatcher once said, the only problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money to spend. So now we want to get back to growth. We want to get back to jobs. We want to get back to creativity. To do that, And this is going to be a very, very big conversation for this country. To do that, you've got to get back to who we historically have been. The most entrepreneurial, most creative, hardest working society in the world. And why did we do those things? Because we rewarded them. There's one section of American life that still does that. It's called sports. And you see it every day. I mean, really, really good athletes get more money. You have no successful team in America that operates under redistribution. You know, the best athletes should get exactly the same amount as the worst athlete, because after all, look how bad the worst athlete would feel if they weren't making as much as the best athlete. So when you come to our team, you can't make more than the worst athlete because we don't want you to feel bad. You wouldn't get anybody. Now, we all understand that with sports. And then we get to banks and auto companies where the federal government's now interfering totally. It's no accident that there were 3 auto companies in the United States that were headquartered here. All 3 were in trouble. 2 took government money, 1 didn't. And guess which one's profitable? The one that didn't. Now, is there a, you know, as the Lieutenant Governor said earlier, is there a clue? It's no accident that government supervision is so destructive that Bank of America is asking the government to take $45 billion back so that they can quit being controlled by the Treasury. Because the Treasury bureaucrats don't have a clue how to run international banks. And of course, the federal government doesn't necessarily want the money back because it wants to control. And it's no accident that having a pay czar in the White House is about as dumb an idea as has occurred since the Soviet Union disappeared. I mean, we would have said to the Russians, don't have a pay czar in the Kremlin because that will destroy your ability to tell who ought to get paid and who shouldn't. And this administration goes out and finds a guy who I know personally is a reasonably decent guy, hasn't got a clue what he's doing. I mean, he's a negotiator and an arbitrator by trade. He has no possibility of knowing what the 3rd level down person at Wells Fargo should earn. No possibility. And yet, he's a czar. Which I think, by the way, is unconstitutional. I think this whole group of people who were appointed without going through Senate confirmation is just plain unconstitutional. So, in this setting, what would we do? At American Solutions, our proposal, and I'm going to outline this and then we're going to toss it over to you. Our proposal is 3 big stages. Stage 1, control federal spending, replaced failed bad government with 21st century new systems, get back to a balanced budget, to get rid of our debt and go back to a system that's healthy. 2, focus on developing American energy to replace foreign imports so that we create jobs in Mississippi. My position is very straightforward. I would rather have enhanced oil recovery in Mississippi to pay for jobs in Mississippi than send the money to Venezuela. Very straightforward. And frankly, if we brought home $400 or $500 billion a year that we're currently spending to import energy, you'd have a huge improvement. Remember that would mean in a year and a half, just in energy alone, you'd have brought home the equivalent of the entire stimulus package. In a year and a half, and you do it in perpetuity. Excuse me. 3, we believe at American Solutions that there are 5 major, bold tax changes that will make us competitive with China and India and lead us back to 3.5% unemployment, which is the natural number we ought to be at. Excuse me. The first one, thanks, Jeff. The first, and in some ways the key starting point, is a 2-year, 50% reduction in Social Security and Medicare taxes, both for the individual and for the employer match. Now, we want to do this for 2 reasons. First of all, we want every individual who's working to have increased take-home pay. So everybody's in the game. Second, we want every small business in America to be able to keep their half of the matching money so that they have more cash flow so they can survive without borrowing money from the banks who don't want to loan it right now, so they can go back and start hiring people again. Because 3 out of every 4 new jobs is created by small business. At the end of 2 years, we would have entitlement reform designed, and at that point, every American would know what was at stake because they'd all have seen how much they're paying in taxes. And we'd have a much different conversation. Part 1. 2, for everyone who wants the United States to create jobs as rapidly as China, we should match the Chinese capital gains tax, which is 0. Now, I just want you to think about this for a second. We're back to 2 plus 2 equals 4. Everybody says, boy, look at all the investment in China, right? 0 capital gains. So why don't we try 0 capital gains? Well, that'd be terrible. That would mean all those people who invested wouldn't pay any tax on their investment. So it's better for them to go to China to invest than to come here because we're not going to let them not pay taxes. The Chinese are going to let them not pay taxes, but at least we feel virtuous about punishing them. I predict if we went to 0 capital gains in the United States and you could invest without paying capital gains tax, you would see in the next year a flood of new investments, creating new factories, financing new businesses, creating new entrepreneurship. Third, we believe small business should be able to write off 100% of its investments in new technology and in new equipment in 1 year. And the reason is we want the American worker to be the most productive in the world by having the most modern equipment in the world, which means we will, A, bring jobs back home because we can compete successfully with China and India, and B, we'll create an entire new tool industry providing the tools that small business will now be able to afford to buy. And so again, we will create more jobs. 4, if you want American corporations to compete in the world market, then we should match the Irish corporate tax rate, which is 12.5%. Now understand today, between state and federal corporate taxes, we have the highest tax rate in the world, about 3 times the Irish tax rate, which means it's like running a race in which our team has to carry a 60-pound pack. And if we were to liberate American companies by reducing their taxes to 12.5%, this is an idea we got from Craig Barrett, the former CEO of Intel, you'd see an explosion of competitiveness. Finally, 5th, we believe we should permanently abolish the death tax. Overwhelmingly, 80% of the American people agree. If you work all your life, you save all your life, you build up a nest egg all your life, the government has no moral authority to take that money from you and your family, and it is fundamentally wrong. Now, I believe a program on this scale between energy, tax cuts, and controlling government spending would move us back towards 3.5% unemployment, which is the natural rate, the churning rate of unemployment. And it would do so with remarkable speed. And I believe if you liberated the American people from bad government, which would carry you on to regulatory reform and litigation reform and education reform so every worker is fully trained, I think in a decade we could compete with China and India, and for the next 100 years we'd be the most successful country in the world once again. But that requires real change. We're not going to do marginally more or marginally less of dumb things in Washington. I want to say one last thing about principle. The stimulus package that was passed in January and February was designed on a failed model of trickle-down bureaucracy. Pour $787 billion in up here, Some of it will get down here to Jackson, Mississippi, and somehow you'll magically be better off. Now, it is so badly designed that they're actually doing a special order in the House this afternoon making fun of the fact that the White House website for the stimulus showed how many jobs had been saved in the 15th District of Arizona. And there is no 15th District of Arizona. It's just a dumb idea. I mean, trickle-down bureaucracy has never worked anywhere on the planet. What we believe in is build up entrepreneurship and build up small business. That when you grow organically with real systems of people who go out every day and earn a living by the old-fashioned hard way, they have to actually please a customer. They don't have to please a lobbyist. They don't have to please a bureaucrat. They don't have to please a politician. They have to please a customer. We believe that's the way. So we are for a build-up entrepreneur and small business approach. Our friends are for a trickle-down bureaucracy approach, which has never worked. That's where we are today. We believe that this is actually a historic moment for America because the combination of the radicalism of the Obama-Pelosi-Reid team and the economic problems has brought the American people to pay attention. And I think we're having a bigger conversation about what America needs to do than we've had at any time since the 1930s. And so I actually believe we're going to come out of this in the next few years remarkably stronger, remarkably wiser, and with policies that get us back on the track to being the most productive country in the world. What I'd like to do, if it's okay, is toss it open. Do we have microphones down here?
We do. If you have a question or comment that you want to be a part of the dialogue and discussion with Speaker Gingrich, we have volunteers with microphones in the aisles. If you'll simply raise your hand, get their attention, they will come to you. And then as far as those of you that are on stage with me, if you'll raise your hand, get my attention, we'll get the microphone to you. I believe we have our first question here on the front row, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I have a comment, and that is, I'm going to add to what Margaret Thatcher said. And I think this is a very important additive, and that is by the time that you've spent someone else's money, you've killed all the incentive of people who were enterprising in the first place. And that enterprising effort is truly one of the great gifts in creating wealth.
I think that's right. I agree entirely with that, and I will add, what's your first name? Laura. Laura, okay. So I'm now going to have the Margaret Thatcher and Laura. That's very good.
Yes, I'm a business owner. I started my company in '94 with a little 500 square foot rented office space. I have about 60 employees now with 50,000 square feet of manufacturing space. Luckily, I'm in the food business, so people still eat. They do change their eating patterns. But a couple things in terms of my thought process. I agree, first of all, with everything you said. One thing that would help tremendously, I think, is to change the manner in which we collect the federal income tax. If you go into Walmart, 30% of that store is food. 90% of that comes from this country. The other 70% of the store, 90% of that comes from overseas. The stuff that is manufactured here has got an embedded tax of about 17% in the cost of the goods. Everything coming from overseas, there's zero. And if our income taxes were paid when we purchased, which that's 70% of the economy is having the consumer, if that was paid when it's purchased, all of a sudden the playing field would get level. We'd have the basically the Chinese products taxed without having a tariff, and we'd be giving a tax break to our products. All of a sudden we'd be very, very competitive. The other thing, a short-term idea I think that I've had as far as helping a person like myself, and I think there's millions of us out there, is to be able to provide some type of financing as an incentive that would not cost the taxpayers a penny for capital improvement, capital investment, for established businesses that are, say, $100 million or less, with a an interest rate maybe 1% above the T-bill rate, 10-year T-bill rate, termed out over 10 years, interest only for 5, and no payment for a year, with a capital, actually a tax credit on a portion of that investment. Just some thoughts there.
Let me ask you too, the first one is a little bit like the flat tax,
Yes, it is.
or the fair tax.
Yes, it
rather,
is.
The fair
Yeah.
tax, and there's John Linder, as you know, has written a book on that, and it's a very interesting proposal. The only observation I'd make is that to go to a fair tax, you'd really have to repeal the constitutional amendment that permits the income tax, because I would never want Congress to have the right to both have the equivalent of a sales tax and have the income tax simultaneously, because they'll do both. The second comment is, the only question I'd ask you to think about, and maybe send us a note later on at American Solutions, is what's the difference between the proposal you just made on capital availability over 10 years and the way the Small Business Administration actually operates? Can you have it one more time? Or is it already? Okay.
Like I said, I've built my business. I'm in a position where we've seen things certainly soften up. We're going to be down a little bit this year versus last year. I'm in a position where I need to expand. I'd like to upgrade some equipment, add some jobs. I'm not going to go out and borrow any more money, especially with the political climate, so on and so forth. I can. I'm in a position I do have credit available. The big difference would be, you'd have to qualify the business through the SBA, but having a package where it's a 10-year term, 5 years, the first 5 years interest only, and the first year no payments, basically. So how could I say no? Mm-hmm. I'd be out in my company, we were out working to sell that capacity that's coming on stream, and I really wouldn't have any downside major cash flow problems.
To what extent, if we allowed you to write off your investment in a year, to what extent would that help you?
That doesn't really help.
Okay.
And the reason it does, but it doesn't. The reason it doesn't is, number one, you've got to assume you're making a profit, okay? And that's one thing, but you're going to write it off anyway. It's whether you do it now or over 5 years, or over 3 years. I mean, the only thing it really saves you is the time factor of that money. You're still going to get the write-off.
Okay.
But this would put you in a position as a business owner that you've got this financing package that you really can't refuse. I mean, I'd jump on it in a heartbeat.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Somebody over here.
There you go.
First, let me clarify. Was it you who somewhere around last year said, referring to AIG, if you're too big to fail, then you're too big to run? Was it you who said that?
No, I never said that exactly.
All right, I'm sorry. I thought I had seen you on the news. But my question is when it comes to larger companies, maybe making the decision to cut corners or do something that they shouldn't do, and it kind of gets us in that situation like with AIG. What role, if any, do you think the government should play in making sure that larger corporations maybe play fair or don't do something that would jeopardize the interests of the country?
Well, what I said last year is that if you are too large to fail, you're too large to be managed.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so if you look at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are the two huge multi-trillion-dollar housing guaranteed companies that are both government guaranteed, they're so big nobody knows how to run them. If you look at the part of AIG that got in trouble, it was actually a subsidiary in London. I mean, and I just think we got to understand that when you get into systems that big, they're going to fail. What I also said was you can't have capitalism on the way up and socialism on the way down. I mean, if you go out and you decide that you need to have a high risk, big time operation because you're going to get to be really, really rich, and you're wrong, then the rest of us don't owe you a bailout. And I really think we'd have been I think that we would have been much better off to let AIG go under. They would have gone through bankruptcy. I think, frankly, we've been better off to let General Motors go through bankruptcy. And they would have come out the other end, just as airlines have done and other people have done. We have orderly processes for dealing with stupidity. What we've now done, is we said, don't hire a bankruptcy lawyer, hire a lobbyist. Go find the right congressman to bail you out with everybody else's money. I think that's fundamentally wrong. And I think it's going to get us in continuing trouble.
Mr. Speaker, we have a question here on stage or comment. And ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you when you get the microphone, please give us your first name so that we can continue the conversation.
Mr. Speaker, I'm Bill Schuff. I'm an MBA student here at Millsaps. The world's most powerful nation is losing manufacturing jobs to countries overseas, and the people are wondering how we can stop that, except the situation is 200 years ago, and Britain is losing jobs to us, an upstart nation with a fast-growing economy. Is it realistic to expect that we can avoid the same fate as Great Britain did 200 years ago and keep manufacturing jobs here as opposed to Mexico, China, or India?
Sure. Let me explain partly why. When we were acquiring manufacturing jobs here, we were actually a high cost of labor country, but we were extraordinarily efficient. So the cost per unit of production was much lower because you got much more productivity per American. Now, how do you get productivity per American? It's a little bit what Laura said. You start and you encourage the people who are entrepreneurs. Think back to the great American breakthroughs. Henry Ford, who is working at the Edison Electric plant in Detroit as a foreman, goes home at night to build his first car. And he's building a racing car as a hobby in 1899. And he's a classic entrepreneur because the first car that he builds is wider than the doors of his garage. And he didn't plan it right, and so he has to knock down the wall of his garage to get the car out. And to further that story, Henry Ford and his friend, there are so few cars around that in order not to scare horses during the daytime, they drive the car at night, and the first recorded pedestrian accident is Henry Ford running over somebody. And his car is so light that they jump out of the car with the front wheels on the guy's chest. And they actually talk to him, Henry Ford and his friend who are riding around. They say, do you think it would be better off if we pushed it over you or if we lifted it straight up? And the pedestrian's laying back there talking with Ford about what's the best way to get the wheels on, okay? And I always tell people, if we'd had trial lawyers in 1899, Henry Ford would never have invented the car because he'd have been sued and he'd have gone broke, okay? Now, and he goes on from there to create standardized production and ultimately the assembly line and the largest mass production system in the world. Parallel example, same time period, 1903. The Wright brothers are two bicycle mechanics in Dayton, Ohio, who at a time when bicycle mechanics were relatively sophisticated jobs, who were really passionate about flight, and they'd studied birds. They built their own wind tunnel. And they were smart enough to say that they would like to go and they would like to figure out what's the best place in America that has uplift on the wind. So they went to the U.S. Weather Service, and they found out that Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, has the most continuous wind coming in off the ocean of any place in America. So every spring, they would take a trainload of wood and go down to Kitty Hawk. Now, why are they taking extra wood? Because they knew something really profound. They didn't know how to fly. And so they would get up in the morning and they would take their plane to the top of the hill and they would try to fly and it would crash. And this was a very light plane, and when it crashed, part of it would break. And they'd get out the extra wood, they'd fix it, and they'd go back. They'd do this 6 or 7 times a day. They did this for several years. In December of 1903, they fly for the first time. The entire flight is less than the wingspan of a Boeing 747 and is slow enough that one brother runs along next to the plane holding onto the wing so that it won't tip over. Okay? By contrast, the Smithsonian, which is a very smart scientific institution with very smart scientists, gets $50,000 from the federal government. The Wright brothers did the whole thing on their own money. The Smithsonian gets $50,000 from the federal government to invent an airplane. And they have really smart scientists, and they do really smart mathematics. And they design a really complicated plane that's much heavier than the Wright brothers plane. And they think, how am I going to get my plane to fly? And they go, I know, we'll build a catapult on a boat, and we'll launch it out over the Potomac. Now remember, the number one ground rule the Wright brothers had was, we don't know how to fly, and so we're going to wreck the plane, and then we're going to fix it. Well, if you launch the plane off a boat over the Potomac, and it doesn't fly, it goes in the Potomac. So for years, the Smithsonian was so mad at the Wright brothers, because you had these two guys who are bicycle mechanics who are flying at a totally unknown place called Kitty Hawk. And the Smithsonian's first reaction is, no, you're not. And the Wright brothers got so mad that for 37 years they wouldn't give the Smithsonian their airplane. They finally got over it late in their life. And if you go to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, you'll see the Wright brothers flyer. Now, why am I telling the story? One last example, and you're going to see how this comes right back to how do we compete with China and India. Thomas Edison is the greatest inventor in the history of the United States. At his peak in 1929, 6% of the gross domestic product of the United States was Edison inventions. The motion picture, the electric light, a whole range of other things. The recordings that we use, the modern record. So he's a fanatic inventor. He decides to invent the electric light. At around 9,000 failures, one of his assistants says to him, you realize, Mr. Edison, that we failed 9,000 times? He said, no, we have successfully eliminated 9,000 possibilities. Edison ended up saying, he believed it took 49,000 experiments to invent the light bulb. And his favorite phrase was, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Now, why am I telling you this? We have been a very high-cost, high-income society, at least since 1790. And we have invented the future at such a dramatic rate that we've been so much more productive than anybody else, that we've been the largest economy on the planet since about 1840. And I believe if we liberate you, if we encourage every person here to go out and found a company, to invent a new product, to create a new service, to do something you want to do, and you know that there's a big reward for doing it, that it's more rewarding to be a great entrepreneur than it is to be a rock star or than it is to be an athlete, that you ought to go out and create something that will last for a lifetime and employ thousands of people. You'll just see an explosion of American energy. And in that process, I have zero doubt that we'll compete with anybody, that we'll be the center of manufacturing. We are today, by the way, a larger manufacturer than China. We're also an economy dramatically bigger than China. We're bigger than the next 4 economies combined. I mean, we don't need to get defeated by our own, bad feelings. We need to go out and just solve the problem and get on with it. Thank you.
If I can just give you one more quote from Thomas Edison, he also said that most people miss opportunity because it's dressed in overalls and looks like hard work.
There you go. That made my case, but I did. I'll steal that too. We got a lot of good lines today.
We have a
Mr.
question up
Speaker,
at
my
the top.
name is Jerry. I'm 68 years old. I'm retired. I'm quite concerned that our form of government seems to be on the verge of being broken. We have a Congress and an administration that can't figure out that 2 and 2 equals 4. We have a Congress at the federal and even at the state levels that spend more time every day trying to figure out how they're going to stay in office. It's not a career they were elected to originally. It was to work for the betterment of this country. We're not doing that anymore. I've been to a couple of Tea Party rallies. I've seen signs that said it's time for another revolution. What do we do to get back to what the original founding fathers had as a way to run the government, go do the people's business, go back to your country, go back to your state, take care of your lives?
Well, I mean, the genius of the American Constitution is that we provide every 2 and 4 years for a revolution. It doesn't, we don't have bullets, we have ballots. We don't have battlefields, we have campaigns. And so everybody, I would say to everybody in the Tea Party movement, go recruit candidates everywhere. And go and say, and I have a very firm rule. If you figure out how the 2 + 2 = 4, and you have an incumbent who can't figure out 2 + 2 = 4, you have to explain to them that you're going to allow them to go back to remedial education by retiring them. And they'll tell you, well, I really love you, but I hated to do this to your business. And the answer is, I understand that, and I hate to fire you, but I'm going to. I mean, that's the American system. Now, does that mean it's hard work? Of course it's hard work. None of these guys who have power are going to give it up voluntarily. But that's all right. There are a lot more of us than there are of them. And so we just have to go and dig them out and replace them. But I am for, this is not a comment about Republican Party, by the way. I am for replacing anybody in either party. I'm for running conservative Democrats in primaries in districts that are all Democrat. I'm for saying to Republicans, if you don't shape up, we're going to replace you. I mean, I have no more interest in a Republican who's... But Jerry, what this does do is it puts the burden back on each one of the 300 million Americans to be a citizen. And if we decide in 2010 and 2012 that we will be citizens, we'll be surprised and delighted at how dramatic the changes will be and how fast the economy will recover and how dramatically more exciting America will be.
Mr. Speaker, my name's Richard. I've been part of founding, investing, advising, played some role in about 20 plus companies. I'm a rehabilitated investment banker and an institutional private equity investor. To this gentleman's statement, if you are successful with the tax policies that you suggest, I would bring back the tax benefit transfer, which you might remember from 1981, which was a very effective way of transferring tax benefits from people, companies, particularly early stage companies that couldn't use them, to companies that were taxable and could use them. And it's particularly effective for startup companies because they often go through a period of years where they're spending so much money and their revenues don't exceed their cost that they could really benefit from tax benefit transfers. Good. I saw tax benefits transfers work. I actually was an investment banker in November of, I think it was 1981 when that law was passed. I created the analytical method that everybody used to value those things, because when they were passed in August, nobody knew how to value them. But there is a mechanism for valuing, and I'd suggest, it doesn't have to be tax benefit transfers, but some mechanism like that.
But it did work and it'd be useful. It'd be great for you if you would write us a brief note on that and lead us to the stuff you did back then. That'd be great. Okay. Very interesting idea.
Mr. Speaker, my name's John. I'm an 85 graduate of Millsaps. We're certainly glad to see you here. I'm still actually studying. My tutor in Mandarin is in Beijing, and I'm on Skype with her about once a week. So here's a question that comes to you from Beijing, Lao Xiaoho, who's listening to watching the streaming version of this on the internet. Lao Xiaoho asks the following: in the 1920s, the Bolsheviks.
Isn't that like 5 o'clock in the morning?
Yep, absolutely. She's here, trust me. She works almost around the clock. In the 1920s, the Bolsheviks seized control of the agricultural mechanism in Russia, kicked out the kulaks, and mandated tight-fisted control of the agricultural economy there. In the next 5 years, about 18 million people starved to death. The next thing that happened is they took their show on the road to the Ukraine, which had always been known as the breadbasket of Europe for 400 years because it was such a fertile farm territory. They seized control of the agricultural economy. In the next 5 years, 27 million people starved to death. So Mao Zedong thought it was such a good idea. He once again thought that, well, he seized control of the agricultural policy, and he said, but this time we're much smarter than they were, and it's going to work because we'll take so much more control over people's lives. In the next 5 years, 48 million Chinese starved to death. They took it to Tibet, and they decided, well, the Hans were just not smart enough. We're smarter than they were, and we're going to have more control over people's lives. This time the total was 21 million people. They took it to India, and they said, but this time we're so much smarter, and we're going to take even more control over people's lives. In the next 5 years, 48 million Indians starved to death. So far this year, this administration and Congress has seized control of about 30% of the American economy. So Lao Shaho's question that she wanted me to refer to you is the justification this time that this group is so much smarter than everyone was before, or is it they're going to take so much more control over people's lives?
Well, it never occurred to me to compare Barney Frank or Rahm Emanuel to a member of the Comintern. But then I frankly haven't had many questions asked from Beijing in the middle of a Mississippi college auditorium. First of all, she's describing, and as you apply it to America today, why Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom. Because Hayek, who was part of the Austrian School of Economics, came to the conclusion in 1944 that the great danger of planned economies is that you have to extend power further and further and further because people won't do what you want. And in fact, Orwell said he wrote in 1984 not particularly about the Soviet Union, but about planned economies. Now, let me give you an example. Some of you remember in 1979, 1980, Jimmy Carter decided that he would fix the energy problem by rationing gasoline, promptly creating government-imposed artificial scarcity. And some of you who are older will remember you would buy gasoline every other day based on the last number of your car. How many remember when you could buy gasoline only every other day? Those who are young will find this weird. So one of the people we work with is Dave Bossie at Citizen United, who helps make the movies that we do. And Dave said to me one day, he said, I was 13 that year. And my dad every morning would give me a screwdriver. And I would go out and I would change the license tag so that the car that needed gasoline had the right license for that day. And I got to thinking about this, and I decided I found the perfect test question to distinguish liberals and conservatives. If the government adopts a program dumb enough that 13-year-olds are taught to cheat in order to be practical, and you're a conservative, you say, we ought to drop that program. It doesn't work. But if your answer to that story is, we need license plate police at every gas station. Then you may be a candidate to work for the Obama administration. I mean, that's how fundamental. And so what she was asking in a fundamental way is very real. I'll give you one other example that Clifton and I were in we were in Beijing this August, but we were down in south central China 5 years ago in Nanjing. And in Nanjing, there's this huge bridge. And on each side of the bridge, there's like a 25-foot or 30-foot tall cat. One is a white cat and one is a black cat. And Deng Xiaoping, who is as important to modern China as Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain or Ronald Reagan in the United States, Deng Xiaoping in 1992 goes on what's called the Southern Tour. And he's been trying since 1978 to get across to the Chinese communist leadership that Mao Zedong's policies just don't work. Having everybody dress in pajamas and run around, being uniformly the same is just impossible. So he goes to South China and he says, look, I don't care if it's a white cat or a black cat. I care if it catches the mice. And what is he saying? He's saying, don't tell me a policy is communist or a policy is capitalist. Does it create jobs? Now, I found myself this year. We were in Beijing, and then we went north to three cities in Manchuria. And we were talking with leaders in all four cities. And they were more capitalist than anybody in the current White House. And they were all saying to me, it's really bad that you guys are borrowing all this money. And you really need to get back to making things pay for themselves. Now, they don't have a stimulus plan. They have an investment plan. What they're doing to get their economy rolling is they are building a 230-mile-an-hour train between every major city in the country. So when they get done spending the money, there will be a huge, the most modern rail system in the world. And part of that's because if you have 1,300,000,000 people, you'll never build enough airplanes. And so they really need high-speed trains. But they're also going to then have, guess what? The best high-speed train manufacturing system in the world. I mean, that's thinking about the future in a serious way. That sounds more capitalist than the stimulus plan, which paid off the politicians to avoid making hard decisions. Just think about the difference. So I start, whether it's with Medicaid, which ought to be dramatically reformed, or it's education, or whatever it is. Why don't we apply the Deng Xiaoping rule? If it works, let's keep doing it. If it doesn't work, maybe we should change it. And I think that's my answer. I think the current group, by the way, combines not knowing very much with a stunning level of arrogance. And I think that's why you get. And I believe if you watch some of the congressional hearings, it is despicable, the contempt with which elected officials treat citizens of the United States, and in and of itself, that would justify firing them.
I'm a senior business major. You often hear outsourcing is a bad thing in the sense that it increases unemployment. What do you think about outsourcing jobs such as manufacturing to lower costs, increase cash flow, encourage expansion, and create jobs that way?
Well, I think if outsourcing enables an American company to survive, it's a good idea. But I would say to anybody who doesn't want outsourcing, fine. Show me how you're going to lower taxes, you're going to lower litigation, you're going to lower regulation, so it makes more sense to insource than to outsource. I mean, I want to create an American manufacturing system. I talked to a guy recently who brought all of his manufacturing back from, this was just before the collapse of Wall Street, but he had brought all of his manufacturing back from Thailand to San Diego, because he said he figured out that it was actually cheaper to manufacture in San Diego. I was in Cincinnati yesterday, which is one of the great centers of manufacturing in the United States, and they all said that with the program we were outlining at American Solutions, none of them would outsource, because in fact it would be cheaper to build things in the U.S. So I would say that when I hear somebody who wants to have a heavily regulated, heavily litigated, heavily taxed, heavily unionized company and not outsource, I'm looking at somebody who wants the American company to collapse totally. But I'm happy to say to them, fine, you show me how you're going to make it cheaper, because if you can't make it less expensive here, you're not going to compete in the world market. Now, I want to make it less expensive through modernization, innovation, entrepreneurship, and I'm prepared to have a tax code which makes us the leading manufacturing country in the world. And then you'll have people in China and India going, why do we keep outsourcing to the U.S.? And that ought to be our goal, is to say, let's make it better to build here than anywhere else in the world, and let other people worry about outsourcing for a while. Okay?
Mr. Speaker, I believe we have a question.
Hi, Mr. Speaker. My name's Britt Eblingvelt. My question pertains to both immigration and unemployment. And I was curious as to your opinion about why we haven't closed our borders to illegal aliens when unemployment is so high and U.S. citizens are losing jobs to these illegal aliens. And also, what would your recommendation be to somebody who is currently going through a job search aside from patience and networking?
Well, let me work backwards. My advice for going through a job search is to be very, very persistent. Never allow yourself to get discouraged, and look on a wider and wider basis and take a job. I mean, taking almost any job to get in the habit of going to work every day, to begin the process of being able to talk to people from a job is an enormous step in the right direction. And so the several people here who have been around for a while might be glad to chat with you in more detail, but I'm having a lot of folks who I have a hunch have been through it in their own lives are nodding yes. But I think that's the key to the job search part. I want to draw immigration into two very different parts. I believe what we ought to do is have a very, very large H-1B immigration program that allows highly technical people and highly skilled people to come to the United States, because frankly, I would rather have them open the next software company in Silicon Valley or in Austin or in Jackson than have them open it in Bangalore or have them open it in Canada. I mean, Microsoft opened an entire research center in Canada because they couldn't get the scientists from China and India into the United States. Now, all that did was it moved the jobs out of the U.S. So if you're talking about legal immigration of highly skilled people, I'd like to have a very large, very robust program that actually encourages the best people in the world to come to the U.S. to help us create jobs, because they're not going to take jobs. They're going to dramatically increase the total number of jobs in the U.S. I think 40% of the founders in Silicon Valley are from India. 20% are from the Indian Institute of Technology, more than from any American university. And they created things that are enormously big systems that have created an amazing number of jobs and an amazing amount of wealth. I think on illegal immigration, it is complicated. First of all, it's declined substantially because there aren't jobs here. And in fact, it's also the amount of money being sent overseas by workers here has declined because they're not making as much money. So there's been a significant shift in the last year. But I want to make the following case. One, I am for absolute control of the border for national security reasons. Two, I am for English as the official language of government, and I'm very comfortable with people who come to America to learn to be American, but that means in part they need to learn English. And I'm prepared to have federal government programs that help them learn English, but I want them to learn English. Three, I believe there has to be a guest worker program that is legal, structured, and enforceable. I do not believe it is. I think it's, for all practical purposes, impossible to try to run this economy without a guest worker program, because people will just cheat. And again, I'm back to 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, I'd be glad to say to my many friends who don't like this idea, gosh, I wish we could make it work. I don't think we can. Now, what would you do with a guest worker program? They would have to go through a background check to not be felons. They would have to be prepared to sign an agreement to go and pay taxes and obey the law, or be instantly deportable without going through a long process. They would have to give you a biometric, probably a retinal scan and a thumbprint. The identification program should all be outsourced to American Express or Visa or MasterCard, because there's no reason to believe the federal government could run it without corruption. Now, in that setting, if you were able to apply and you were able to become a guest worker because you could get a job and you were going to work and you were going to pay your taxes and you were going to obey the law, then I would say to the employers of America, you have no excuse to hire somebody who's not legally a guest worker. And the economic penalties, not criminal penalties, I think that's a waste of time, frankly. Economic penalties ought to be horrendous so that it becomes prohibitive. Now, if no business will hire somebody illegally because they can hire somebody legally as a guest worker, and because we will pound them economically if they hire somebody illegally, the illegal problem is going to disappear fairly rapidly, because people are going to apply to be legal guest workers. I would not make it an automatic condition that having become a guest worker means you can apply for citizenship. I think we need to think very long and very hard. I think as a practical matter, it is virtually impossible to move everybody who's currently here illegally out of the country. I do not like the concept of amnesty. I would not support amnesty. I think there has to be some fairly strong program that says if you broke the law and you came here illegally, you are behind everybody else. And unless you go home, or in the case of some places like dictatorships, unless you went to a center we established to reapply to be in America. Because there are some countries you can't ask people to go home because it's literally physically dangerous. But I think we cannot go to amnesty again. I voted in 1986 on this. Ronald Reagan signed the Simpson-Mazzoli Act and wrote in his diary, he did it reluctantly because we needed to do it one time. It turned out that it wasn't 300,000, it was 3 million. And it set a pattern that said to people, break the law, come to the U.S., and eventually they'll amnesty. I think that's a very bad principle. And I think, but some package like the one I just described, I think would be the right thing for America.
I believe we have a question up.
Hello, I'm Charles Fairchild, a senior at Madison Central, and I've seen students drop out of high school to help their families make ends meet. And wouldn't a drop in welfare lead to more students dropping out to help make ends meet? And it would just create a broken cycle of people being uneducated. I don't think the problem is work ethic. I think it's our just education and people just living in hard times.
Well, I'm not totally sure I understand you. Are these people who are dropping out to go to work?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me say, first of all, there may be times in people's lives when if you drop out for the purpose of going to work, it's a rational decision. And you then, but then what we ought to have is an ability to drop back in and finish getting either a GED or getting a high school degree, going back to college. I mean, I think we have to confront the fact that in the poorest neighborhoods in America, to trap people in bureaucracies that aren't effective and then wonder why they leave is self-defeating. Now, let me give you the opposite story. One of the most interesting things I've done recently is go around the country with Secretary of Education Arne Duncan and the Reverend Al Sharpton. And I concede up front, it's a little bit of an unusual team. But we've been going around advocating, and I would say this for Mississippi, that every state should adopt an open-ended charter school provision, that the president personally is for this. It's an area where he and I are in agreement, and where I think he's showing some real courage taking on the teachers' unions. And he has said every parent should have the right to know what their children are doing. They should have the right to know whether the school is good or not. They should have the ability to pick another school if this one's not the one they think is right. And every state ought to have an open-ended charter provision so that you can have multiple schools. Recently, we went to Philadelphia, and we went to a school which 3 years ago had tested in the 25th percentile, the bottom fourth of the country. It was the second most violent school in Philadelphia. The state was so desperate they took over the school and they gave it to a charter school system called Mastery. Same building, same neighborhood, 3 years later. New teachers, new principal, new system. So we interviewed the students because this year, after 3 years of change, they scored in the 86th percentile. They were outscoring many of the suburban schools. We visited the 11th grade, inner city, African-American, poor neighborhood. 100% of the 11th grade plans to go to college. We interviewed a young man who's in the 11th grade. We said, what's the difference? He would talk about the old school and the new school as though they were two different buildings. The old school was like this, but my new school is like this. He said, you know, in the old school, we used to fight all the time. And now we don't fight. And I said, well, what's the difference? He said, well, in the old school, they expected you to fight. We were going to fail anyway. And I said, what would you fight over? He said, junk. He said, it didn't matter. We were expected to fight. So we did. Well, I said, why don't you fight now? He said, oh, we're not allowed to. He said, if I fight now, I'll get kicked out, and I want to be here because I want to go to college. And I said, so what do they do? He said, this is really fascinating. He said, they had anger management classes for teenagers. These are inner city kids who've been pretty violent. So they got them in rooms, and we sat through one of the classes with them. And they talked about how to relate to each other and how to, not how to not be angry, but how to manage the anger. Now I saw this with my own eyes. I know this is true. I know it is possible. And so I would start and say, you show me a neighborhood that has a lot of dropouts, I'll show you a neighborhood that needs a new approach to its school. You show me kids who need money, I'll show you a place where to look at part-time work, we ought to look at a number of things. But I think we've got to recognize that if you're truly poor and if your family's truly poor, we have got to find a way to enable you to earn money or you will in fact drop out. I just think that's a fact.
Mr. Speaker, we have time for one more question this evening, and it's going to come from here on stage with us.
Hi, my name is Jacob. I'm a senior political science major here. It's a short question, so you may actually have time for another one. I was just curious if you were planning on running for office in 2012.
Well, our slogan at American Solutions is jobs here, jobs now, jobs first. So we're here having a conference on 2010 jobs, not 2012 jobs. But we may come back, Calista and I may chat with you all around February of 2011. But first, why don't we try to solve problems this year? Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker. Good to be with you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I hope you've been challenged. I hope your perspective's been broadened. If you like what you hear and some of the ideas that Speaker Gingrich shared, visit www.americansolutions.com. Thank you so much. Have a great day.